Have a seat. I don't know about you, but I'm a guy who grew up building forts. Any fort builders here? Any fort builders? So, that's what I'm talking about. Fort builders in the house. Woo woo! That's what I'm talking about. Hey, fort building is an art. It's an art. Now, let me tell you what ruins a good fort. Let me take you back to what ruins, completely kills a good fort. Hey. Oh. Well, it's Father's Day. You're probably going to get away with that one. But be careful. Be careful. In addition to what Matt has contributed, that also ruins forts equally as much. Anybody, let me take you back to the 90s real quick. Maybe the 80s, okay? Somewhere around in there. You know what I'm talking about? You had them blankets. And on them blankets, they're like, they're like 8 by, I don't know what size they are. I don't know. They're just standard blankets. But on the outside of the blankets, you got like 1 million little pieces of thread. You know what I'm talking about? Like 500 million pieces of thread around the whole, like all 4 sides of the blanket got tiny strings hanging off of it. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, great. What is it called? An Afghan, right. So obviously those are out now. I don't know if you know, maybe this is your hint that, hey, the 90s are gone. You can replace those. Go to Hobby Lobby or Michael's or I don't know. Where do you buy blankets? Target. Yeah, go to Target. Go to Hearth and Home and you'll find something that's a little more updated. But you know what I'm talking about? They had chickens on them, or they had like a farmhouse or apples, or they had, I don't know what else was on them. Like a lighthouse sometimes, you know what I'm talking about? Like those are awful for building forts because you've got to have enough weight over the chair, you know what I'm talking about, for it to stay up. But if the problem is the people who made those blankets, those Afghans, the people who made those things, they included the stringy things as part of the blanket. And so you're losing some depth and some weight. And so when that goes over, it actually doesn't hold the blanket. You know what I'm talking about? It doesn't hold the blanket on the other side. So you got to give another foot of weight on the other side of the kitchen table chair so that it will actually stay up. And then your fort gets small. So those are no good for fort building. You actually got to go and take, like your mom and dad's comforter off the bed and get the sheets. That's how you build a good fort. And then you get something heavy, right? You get like a kitchen chair and you put it down the outside, or you get some books, that no one ever reads, but they sit on the coffee table, that kind of thing. Or you get the coffee table and you make it a part of the fort. That's part of what's doing, you know what I'm saying? If you had bunk beds, you had an automatic ceiling in your fort. All you had to do was figure out a way to wrap that bad boy, and you were either in a submarine or you were in a fort or who knows what, but you got to have space inside, because you don't just go in and lay down in a fort. No, you got snack time in a fort, so you got to have snacks. You got to have a little refrigerator in there. You know what I'm talking about? Not a legit refrigerator, but you can make your little refrigerator, steal your little Barbie house from your sister and put it in there, pretend it's not pink, and put your snacks in there. It works great. You got to have room for your guns, right? So you got your Nerf guns, because obviously someone's coming. If you got a fort, you're protecting something or hiding from someone, so you got to be ready in case they show up in your fort. So you got to have room for activities inside the fort, so it's got to be big. So the best time is when you get the kitchen chairs. You know what I'm talking about, with the big wooden kitchen chairs, got the knobs on the top, on the back, and you can kind of like tie things to the knobs, to something heavy in the chair, and it's legit. That's the way you do forts. I don't know when the last time I built a fort, like legit me, built a fort for me. I'm not sure. My kids, right, we kind of ruined, I was looking back on this week, we kind of ruined our kids' childhood because we bought these pre-made fort kits. They just came in a bag and you took it out and it kind of springs open like a tent. You know what I'm talking about? It had tunnels. And like in the time, like we're going to give them the best fort ever. But that's awful. And I ruined it. I can't go back to those moments. And I'm upset about it. So if you're going to make that mistake, stop right now. Make it with the blankets. Okay? I don't think guys ever grow up out of making forts. Like we still like to do. If you're a hunter, you still make a fort in the woods all the time. You just call it a blind. You know what I'm talking about? There's this holiday for the Jewish folks. While there was a temple, the temple has since been destroyed, but when there was a temple, there was a holiday every year when entire families, the focus of the celebration, the festival, was they would build forts together. It's the last of the festivals that God kind of asked Israel to celebrate. And there's 3 big pilgrimage festivals for Jewish folks. This is the last of those. And what it was is you would when I say pilgrimage festival, I mean like everybody, no matter where you lived, you came to Jerusalem. So no matter how far the journey was, you caravanned, you came together, and everybody came to Jerusalem. And so when you got to Jerusalem, you would build these forts. That we call it today the Feast of Tabernacles, right? Maybe sometimes you've seen it, if you've read into the Bible, the Feast of Booths. Booths is just like a hut, right? Or if you want to talk Hebrew, it's called sukkot. I know. You got to be real careful, but that's what it's called. It's called the Feast of Sukkot. So I'm not going to refer to it as that anymore because I don't speak Hebrew. I just wanted to drop some Hebrew on you this morning. You're welcome for it. So the Feast of Tabernacles, what happens is somewhere around mid-September to mid-October, it's the end of the harvest, and so this is a huge celebration. So all of the crops that they put into place, all those things, the harvest has been done, all of the field work is finished, and so there's this enormous celebration. People are excited because the big work season is over. It's behind them. They're excited because of what's in front of them, like there's some rainy season coming. And now most people would think, okay, Jerusalem, it's in the middle of the Middle East. It's like a desert. Maybe you'd be surprised to know that the rainfall annually in Jerusalem is the same as London, right? Now, that's wild. Like, you just think of London being a really rainy place. It's the same in Jerusalem. The thing is that for Jerusalem, it all happens between October and March. And so when this festival goes on, this wasn't the way the festival was originally created, but because of its timing in the year, people started seeing this festival as an opportunity to pray and cry out to God, saying, please provide rain over these next few months, because we're going to need it to have another harvest and crops next year. And so it just naturally kind of evolved into this. It's not what it started as. It started with building these huts. And the reason they built these huts was because for about 40 years, the people of God wandered around in a wilderness waiting for a promised land. They were in slavery in Egypt for about 400 years. They were freed from slavery, and then they were in this wilderness in the Sinai Peninsula. If you want to look it up on a map, you can kind of see where it's at. And they were there wandering around for about 40 years. And while they were wandering around, they built temporary huts or tabernacles or booths, and they were made out of whatever they could find. They had leaves as roofs, and they would move from one place to another. And so every year they would get together and they would retell the story to their kids. And everyone from everywhere would gather in Jerusalem, and they would build a hut, and they would live in it for 8 days. So day 1 was this worship ceremony, this worshipful day called the Sabbath. And then day 8 would be the same thing. They would have another big, huge Sabbath worship ceremony. Right? But for 8 days, they lived in those huts, and they didn't have like land. They would put them anywhere. They just put them on the side of the street. They put them in someone's field. They put them outside. It didn't matter. As long as you could find some space, you built your little hut, and your family stayed in it for 8 days. And you would share, and every night you'd have campfires all over the city, and you would share the stories of your ancestors and the 40 years of wilderness. And you would remind them, hey, sometimes the promised land is for sure worth waiting on. Right? We waited for 40 years after being freed from slavery after 400 years. And so they would share these stories in this Feast of Tabernacles. It was one of their favorite feasts, one of their favorite holidays. In fact, you go so far, you remove yourself from the first century and you go 2 or 3 centuries in advance, just keep going. Eventually, they start referring to this festival as just the holiday because it's their favorite. They absolutely love everything about it. The community, the uniqueness of the huts, sharing the stories with their children, all of those things. The festival itself was known for 3 major things. The first one was sacrifices. It's the festival that had the most sacrifices out of any of them. Every single day at the temple, there was 1 goat, 14 lambs, 2 rams, and a ton of bulls. They started with 13 on day 1, and they went down from 13, 1 a day, every day, all through 8 days. There were 24 divisions of priests that worked at the temple. For this particular week, all 24 divisions were on call and in service because there were so many sacrifices happening every single day at the temple. Now, the other 2 pieces that really stand out that make this festival unique revolved around water. The first piece was every morning there was a water pouring ceremony. And so the priests would wake up, and right at sunup, as the sun was coming right over the mountains, they started blowing what's called as the shofar. It's a ram's horn, and so they would blow it. And there would be this huge parade with the priest leading it, and they would have this jar that held about a quart of water. And they would walk down in this parade fashion through the city south of the temple to a pool called Siloam. And they would take this quart water jar and they would dip it into the pool of Siloam, and they would take it and they would hold it up and they would march back to the temple. So there was this huge parade. The only thing that they were doing in this parade was getting water in this pitcher. And they would get the water in the pitcher and they would go back in. And as soon as they got to the gate, they would go through what's known even today as the water gate. And they would go through the water gate holding this water, and the ram's horns would blow again, and there'd be 3 shouts, and people would start singing, and they would be singing these hymns, and there was like steps that came down, and every time they sang something, they came down another step. And so there was this enormous ceremony. They had brought this water back, and they were about to pour it on the altar. And so they would walk up to the top of the altar where typically you would have an animal sacrifice, but there were also 2 silver basins, one on the left and one on the right. One of those was for normal drink offerings like wine and that kind of stuff. And the other one was specifically for water on this particular festival. And so he would take the water pitcher that held about a quart of water and he would hold it up. Now, as of today, well, I say as of today, the temple's gone. But in, a number of centuries, they started having about 2 centuries. They started saying, when the priest held up the water, they would say, "Raise your hand higher." Because about 100 years prior to when Jesus was there was this one revolt. You see, the water ceremony has nothing to do with the tabernacle or the festival of booths or festival of tabernacles. Right? The tabernacle is about the 40 years wandering around, sharing the stories with your people, knowing you can survive, waiting. But because of the harvest, naturally this has just become a part of it, like over time. So God didn't say, "Hey, do this water thing." It's just a tradition they started. So there was this one priest who was not interested in this whole tradition thing. And so he didn't think it was right to add this water tradition to a tradition that God gave them the festival, said, "Come, gather, do these things." God didn't include the water piece in it. They just started to do it. And so instead, he took the water and he poured it on the ground instead of on the altar. Well, it created a riot. People went nuts. So much so, he called in an outside army and slaughtered 6,000 Jews in the temple. I mean, it was a massacre. From that day on, every time the priest held up the jar of water, they wanted to make sure they could see him put it in the silver little container that fed down to the bottom of the temple mount, of the temple altar. And so he would raise the water, and they would say, "Raise it higher so we can see your hand." And he would raise it up to the sky, and they would watch him put the water in it. And the water would go into the silver basin, and it would go down to the bottom of the altar. And they would pray, "God, we give you a water sacrifice. Would you please answer with rain? Our harvest is over. Would you answer with rain?" So that's the second piece of the festival. The third piece happened at night when the sun goes down. The sun goes down. You know what I'm talking about? Will, no? Nobody else? Okay. All right. Matt, I thought you had me there. No? Okay. So after they have the water pouring ceremony in the morning, they have the water celebration in the evening when the sun goes down. And now, the Temple Mount is broken into a bunch of different sections that are made for specific groups of people. There was this one particular place where this ceremony took place in the court of women, which would typically separate women from men while they're inside the temple structure. Well, they would open this structure up to expand it so that everybody could fit there. And they would put these enormous candles. Now, when I say candle is really not the right thought. It's like the Olympic torch downtown, right? Not that huge, but they've got ladders, like they're huge pieces that up in there. There's this enormous basin of oil, and the wick of this candle is made by old, worn-out priest robes. So when a priest was getting rid of their robe, they would save it, they would tear it up into pieces, and so this had an enormous wick on it, and they would have altar boys like climb up these ladders with gallons of oil and dump it in this thing to make sure that these 4 enormous candles kept burning all night, right? And it was so bright. In fact, there are people outside of people who are followers of Jesus, extra biblical people, that talk about how bright these 4 particular candles were every night during this festival. But they said you could go off outside of the city and look back, and it looked like the entire city was lit up because these candles were so bright. And at the bottom, there were priests that had torches, and they were leading dances, and they were singing, and there was a band playing, not like our band, but like their band, like with percussion and tambourine and harps and lyres and all these things, and trumpets and ram's horns and all. There's this enormous celebration. They were celebrating 2 things. The first thing they were celebrating was they were acknowledging that God had inhabited the space of the temple. You see, in the very center of the temple was a place called the Holy of Holies. And that is where the presence of God rested until Jesus died on the cross. And that veil was torn in two and the presence of God was released. And so they would celebrate. In fact, they called it the great glory of God, or the Shekinah glory. And they would celebrate the fact that the great glory, the great light and glory of God was there and apart and among them. And so that was part of why they celebrated. And so they danced and they sang and they ate and they had this enormous feast and this huge celebration. Every night after night, the entire time of the festival, every night they lit the torches, lit the candles. They started dancing. They started celebrating that God is here with us. God has brought himself into our story, and that is worth celebrating. Now, the second thing that they celebrated was what was to come. You see, they knew that the presence of God, that the light of God was incredible, but that there was still darkness or evil in the world. And so they celebrated that there was still an even greater light to come. A Savior, a Messiah, that they had been waiting hundreds of years for. And so not only are they celebrating the very presence of God in their midst, they're celebrating because they know they can trust that presence of God to send a Savior, to send an even greater light than the light they had previously experienced and were currently experiencing there in the temple. In fact, there's one rabbi that's quoted in almost every single textbook that talks about this particular festival. And he said this about the festival when he experienced it. He said, "He hath not beheld the joy of drawing water. He that hath not held the joy of the drawing of water hath never seen real joy in his life." He said it was such a celebration. If you had never been a part of that ceremony, he said, you have never actually seen pure joy. That's how enormous the celebration was. And it's in this setting. It's during this festival. It's while this is happening that Jesus stands up, gathers everyone's attention, and says this. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And now you know why they wanted to kill him. They're there celebrating like the highlight of their religious year is happening. And they're all talking about, yes, the presence of God is here. But we're not just celebrating this. We're celebrating that there's a Messiah coming. And he's a greater light than anything we had ever experienced. And we know we can trust God for it. We know God is good for it. We know he's going to deliver. We know he's going to be a Messiah. And we will celebrate. And we'll hang out in tents. And we'll share the stories with our kids. And we'll tell about generations gone by. Because this is enormous to us. And Jesus stands up and says, "Hey, that's me." The religious leaders are looking at him like, "No, bro, you're a carpenter. That ain't you. Look around. You think this is for you?" I'm sure Jesus is like, "You ain't seen a party till you seen an angel party. Come on." Here's the problem. Jesus is standing in the middle of the ceremony when he begins to speak. And he says, "I'm the light of the world." Go with me for a second. Let's just say we turned all the lights off in the room right now. We turned them all off. And then we turned one light on. and I were to ask every one of you, hey, point out the light, I think we would probably be pretty flawless in pointing out where the light is. In other words, we don't have any issue identifying what light is, especially when we're in darkness. Yet Jesus has been around them this entire time, and they have no clue that he's the only light in the room. So why is it that light has to explain that he's light? Why is it that light has to say, hey, that's me? Well, John actually gives us some pretty good insight into this. I'm going to read a little brief passage before we actually get to the answer to kind of set it up. But John says this at the very beginning of his book. He says this, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so now we're clear. We know that Jesus is synonymous with this light. Jesus actually says a few chapters later, that's chapter 1, we're down here in chapter 7, right? Jesus is actually saying, hey, here, I'm the light. I'm that guy that he's talking about. And he says that, John says, hey, the light shines in the darkness hasn't overcome it. In other words, the darkness hasn't made to where the light can't shine. So the light is shining, it's just that nobody knows that's what the light is. Nobody identified Jesus as, he's the only light on in the room. So why is that? Well, he gives us a pretty good hint in verse 9. He says, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Why not? Why not? I think it's simple. It's because the light of Jesus doesn't look like our light. It looks like him. The light of Jesus doesn't look like our light. It looks like him. And this is a recurring theme that you'll hear throughout this summer. And it's going to be a recurring theme because our culture, our community is really struggling, hardcore struggling, with having a picture of what they want Jesus to be. Where they've already decided, I know what light I want in my life. I know what light will be acceptable in my life. I know what kind of Jesus I want, and I have predetermined what that Jesus will be. And yet Jesus shows up and says, you don't get to decide who I am. I do, because I am Jesus. So Jesus shows up, and we don't even see that he's the only light in the room, because the light in the room we want to look for doesn't look anything like Jesus. You see, we have a definition of good. In our world, we've got a definition of good. But Jesus shows up and he says, I'm actually what's good. We have a definition of holy. And Jesus shows up, and we realize that Jesus is actually the definition of holy. We have a definition of, hey, this is incredible. And then Jesus shows up, and we realize he's the definition, the living, walking definition of this is incredible. And we begin to realize that the things that we've aligned in our own minds fall short of who Jesus truly is. We've decided that we need Jesus to fit into our mold, and we're in the same place that the religious leaders and everyone else that was celebrating the water celebration that day, where Jesus' light was on and the only one that was in the room, yet we looked around the room and we still didn't see him because he wasn't who we were looking for. We were looking for the version of Jesus we created in our own minds. And Jesus showed up and said, no, this is what light looks like. The truth is that light helps us see things that we can't see, that's in the dark. The light helps us see things that maybe sometimes we don't want to see. I don't know about you. I have a son who likes to play Legos. Anybody else have kids that play Legos and then they clean up and turn the lights off and then you go walk through the room? Here's the deal. If you were to blindfold me, like completely, like I mean legit blindfold, not like see out the little nose things at the bottom. I'm talking about legit blindfold me. I could walk through my house as long as there was nothing on the floor. Like I know where everything is in my house. This is not a problem. I don't know if you have that ability, but I don't know if it's superhuman. I think it's pretty common, right? Like I think it's just normal. Like we know where the stuff is in our house. If I had to walk from the kitchen to my kid's bedroom, I could do it. I mean, I'd probably hit a wall or two, but I'm not like going to smash into something without knowing. Like I know where the stuff is in my house, right? Now in the dark though, right? You put a Lego on the floor, man, I will be talking about this Hebrew festival. You know what I'm talking about? I'll step on that thing and out comes that name. Yes. You know what I'm saying? Especially those 2x3 Legos, you know what I'm talking about? Like the 2x3s, they sit right there. They sit so perfect. And then when you put everything you've got because you are confident you know where things are in the house, and you put your foot on it and you're about to go, and then it flies out it's like the pain shoots through your heel and comes out your mouth. You know what I'm saying? And Jesus shows up and says, hey, I know you think you know your way around this world, but the thing is that there's things in the floor that you're not aware of. And you don't know what you don't know. And this is why I'm going to turn the lights on. For you to see what's left hidden that ordinarily you have not thought about. That in your mind it's not an issue, but it's still an issue. You see, Jesus shows up because we have an enormous need. He's aware of it, but we're not aware of the need because we can't see it. We don't even know it's there. Here are some things we can't see without Jesus. The first one's the future. We can't see the future. Right? I mean, you can go to Miss Rose and have her dish out some cards and tell you some generalities because she looked at your license plate tag and saw that you had a Georgia Bulldog thing and talk about national championships and something else general and make you feel good. Read your palm if you want to. We can't see the future. But the thing is, Jesus shows up and he says, hey, the way this works, when I'm God, I'm already there. And so while you can't see the future, you can trust that I've already seen the future because I'm already there and I will walk with you into your future. And so I'm going to shed some light on some things that are in the dark. And so sometimes we go through tests and trials and preparation moments and we have no idea what we're being prepared for. Yet we begin to get insight and understand that, man, I'm going to take this preparation, this test, this trial, this suffering here because I know there's got to be a purpose. God will leverage this for something good. And so I can't see into the future, but I'm connecting myself to the person who's already in the future, and he is guiding me step by step, one at a time. We can't see God. We can't see him. I haven't had anybody recently that's come in, or ever, not just recently. They came in and said, hey, I had burgers with God last night. It was great. It was super good. We can't see him. Yet Jesus shows up and says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so as we understand who Jesus is in these I am statements week after week, we get a better glimpse of who God is. We can't see our purpose in life. We are running around thinking, you know what, our purpose is to leave generational wealth. Our purpose is to do something so great the name of building after us. So they put my name on a plaque on the side of something. Or maybe I get a brick laid in the concrete that every time someone walks over until that brick cracks and they replace it with just regular concrete, but I'll be gone so I won't know kind of thing. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe that's the purpose in life. We're just going full-blown city slickers this morning. You know what I'm talking about? The one thing? Y'all haven't watched City Slickers? Y'all haven't watched Top Gun either, have you? The one thing. What's life about? And Jesus shows up and says, let me explain to you that purpose is greater than anything that your name is attached to. He said, I'm going to attach you to something so much bigger than yourself that even at your funeral, if you could listen to your own funeral and you could listen to all the great things that you've done in the name of Jesus, even if you could hear it all, you still wouldn't understand the ripple effect that happens when you give everything you've got to the kingdom of God. That's a purpose worth getting behind. We can't see death. We see the results of death. We see what death leaves behind. We can't see death. And Jesus shows up and says, let me paint you a picture of what death looks like. Let me actually undo the veil and share with you what happens after death sets in. The death that we see when the body stops breathing and it's no more. Let me step in and undo the veil. Let me pull it back. Let me undo the shadows and tell you this is what's coming after what we see as the effects of death. It's called eternal life. He goes so far as to even give a couple of visions of what it looks like, what it feels like to live in the presence of God. Jesus is the light, and he opens our eyes to see what we cannot see without him. So when Jesus is standing there and these huge pillars, these candles are lit, and people are dancing, shouting, celebrating, because the presence of God is already there, but they're celebrating the faithfulness of God, that there will be a light that shows up, a Messiah, a greater light than the light they've already experienced, and they trust him and they believe in him. And then Jesus stands up in the middle of it and says, I'm the light of the world. I am the light of the world. Think about that. In their minds, they were just like, man, this celebration right here, the light at the temple, it's lighting up the whole countryside. That's how big our candles are. Like if you go out onto the hills and you look back in, we are the light of Jerusalem. And Jesus says, I ain't seen nothing yet. I'm the light of the world. The world. That was pretty sweet. But there's something even sweeter. Jesus is teaching to a group of folks. And he says this. Matthew 5, verse 14. He looks at those people who are following him and he says this. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Oh, now we're getting somewhere. And you see, when we go back to what he says in John 8, he says, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I'm going to read that to you again. When Jesus spoke again to the people, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. In other words, if you follow Jesus, he says, if you follow me, you will have the light of life. Follow the light, get the light. Follow the light, get the light. Follow Jesus, get Jesus. Come on. Follow Jesus, get Jesus. And what happens when you get Jesus? You become the light. Come on with it. Now that's something to celebrate. The transformational power of Jesus to take you from walking in darkness and a piece of darkness to say, I can turn you into something that's worth celebrating. So I can take the darkest moments of your life and I can leverage them and use them for something that inspires other people. That's the kind of power we're talking about. Follow the light. Get the light. You become the light. Not because of anything we've done, but because of what Jesus does in us. We become the light. Followers of Jesus, let me ask you a question. Do you realize how much your community needs you because you carry the light? You, individually, you very specifically. Do you realize how much your community needs you? Not you collectively. I'm talking about you. Ask yourself right now. Maybe that's what you're thinking. They don't need me. Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. Like a dad in the middle of the night going to help a baby who's crying with a kid who dropped Legos on the floor. They need a light. They need you. Darkness needs a light. Follow the light. Become the light. Follow the light. Become the light. As a church, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to set as many people on fire in the middle of the city as possible. So bright that we don't have to wait for night to fall for people to see the light. But they can see it in your everyday walking around, getting your groceries, eating a Mad Mexican, shopping at Noon and Mercantile, walking in the square, picking up poop off the sidewalk from your dog kind of light. You know what I'm talking about? Like in every single solitary thing that you do, they see the light. And here's the cool thing. And just like Jesus, the light that our community is looking for is not what we are bringing to the table. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that we're actually bringing real, legit, true light. And so people might look at us and say, you're not the flashlight I'm looking for. That's okay, because you already know that what you've got is the flashlight they need. And we would always rather be what they need than what they just are looking for. And that's a really difficult thing. But the clearer we become on who Jesus is, the reality of who Jesus really is, the better chance we got at waking some people up to the darkness that they're walking in. And the darkness that they continue to hurt themselves in because they're walking on stuff they didn't see was there. Follow the light. Become the light. So you're in one of a couple places this morning. Maybe you're in a place where you didn't actually think that this was doable for you. That if anything, if I asked you to associate who you are with something, it would not have been light. And you have an opportunity to really consider, do I have the light of Jesus? Am I the light of Jesus? And if the answer to those questions are no, then you already know, hey, you need to create a next step. We've got a blue tent right outside. It's called our Next Steps tent. And so you need to go have a conversation about, hey, I want to be able to do this. I don't know how to do this, but I want to. I want to do this. Or maybe you're already a follower of Jesus and you're nervous because all of us know what it's like to have a kid with a flashlight and it's really dark outside, and when they want to talk to you, they shine it in your eyes. And it's like, man, good gracious. Or it's the middle of the night and you're asleep. Your wife decides she has to find something. Not that my wife would do that. She comes in, she flips on the light. It's like, what is going on? What have I done? You know? And maybe that makes us nervous. Like, I don't want to get this light out because it'll make people be like, oh, right? You're right. If it was that kind of light. But the light you got with Jesus isn't that kind of light. It's not the, oh, that makes my eyes hurt kind of light. It's the thanks for saving me from stepping on this Lego kind of light. It's a you just made my life easier kind of light. You just unlocked some purpose in my life kind of light. So don't apologize or sit in fear with it. We walk around and we give light. Because when we follow the light, we have become the light.